Across from him, Ira sat with her usual composure, though there was a distinct glint of amusement in her copper-toned eyes. Her long ears twitched with quiet satisfaction like a conductor at the end of a successful performance. "It's official," she said, setting down her cup. "The council has reviewed your integration file." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Am I being deported, promoted, or cloned?" "None of the above," she replied smoothly. "You've been granted permanent liaison status should you choose to remain." Jake leaned back, letting the weight of the words sink in. Should you choose to remain? Once upon a time, he'd boarded a cargo shuttle with a backpack, a system certification, and a vague hope for better pay. Now he was sipping mood-sensitive tea while being offered permanent residence on a station full of aliens, alien women no less, who had once studied him like a fascinating glitch in the simulation, and now spoke to him like a peer, even a friend. "I don't suppose this comes with a dental plan?" he asked. Ira's ears curved in what he now recognized as a grin. "Only if your teeth are psychic." He looked around. The arboretum was filled with life. Terrilla was floating 3 feet off the ground while explaining quantum humor to a group of initiates. Jeff, the once predatory plant, now wore a small sign that read, "Hugsree consent mandatory." Injiva, ever the linguistic enthusiast, was reciting a Terran limerick while being dramatically fanned by 2 flutter-eared researchers who seemed to think sarcasm was an advanced mating call. Jake had changed. There was no denying it. The man who had once triple-checked elevator buttons for fear of being watched was now someone who smiled when alien children asked if they could touch his legendary human kneecaps. He had learned to navigate the absurdity to bend without breaking, to laugh at the chaos, and somewhere along the way to belong. Later that day, a ceremony was held. He hadn't been told in advance, of course. That would have ruined the spontaneity. Apparently, the entire station gathered in the Harmony Chamber, a vast crystalline amphitheater that amplified sound until it became song. Even the AI joined in projecting a holographic version of itself as a vaguely humanoid librarian with roller skates. Jake stood at the center while the crew surrounded him in concentric circles, each group humming a frequency specific to their species. The air trembled with resonance. Ivor stepped forward, holding a slim, elegant device that looked like a remote control fused with a wand and a marshmallow. "In recognition of your contribution to Lashara 9, she said, "and in celebration of your unexpected but profound impact on our cohesion, humor, and plant management systems, we offer you the title of kin for Mama Bridge, a participant, a friend." Jake took the device. It buzzed gently in his hand, then released a puff of glitter that smelt like fresh bread and made his ears feel warm. "Do I get a badge?" "You already have the socks," she said, and indeed, as he looked down, he saw that someone, probably several someones, had finally completed the pair. Bioluminescent, self-heating, slightly purring, the socks shimmered with patterns that matched the station's orbit. Over the next week, the station's rhythm seemed to shift again. Jake found himself offering suggestions on crew structure. His once comedic explanations of Earth customs were now studied and translated into policy drafts. Even the food replicators had begun to recognize his preferences, though they still refused to call what they made pizza. One evening, he stood alone on the observation deck, sipping another cup of that strange, wonderful tea. The stars stretched across the void like ancient fireflies frozen mid-dance. Beside him, the reflection in the glass showed a man who was less out of place than he'd ever been. A little scruffier, maybe, a little bolder, not entirely sure what he was becoming, but sure that he wasn't alone anymore. Ploop nestled beside his foot, having grown slightly larger, and now featuring a single blinking eye that occasionally winked. "So," Jake said aloud, "you think I made the right call staying?" Ploop gurgled in a tone that Jake chose to interpret as obviously. Just then, the soft ping of a message alert rang through the chamber. It was from Terrilla Emergency Translation System, attempting to recite, "Earth knock knock, joke situation, deteriorating rapidly your assistance. Required. Jake sighed, finished his tea, and turned toward the quarter. He didn't walk, he strolled, confident, accustomed. Amused because working here was different. The end. Appeared without a sound her tray, holding a single perfectly cubed portion of something that emitted a soft hum. You're adapting faster than expected, she said. I think I've gone numb, Jake replied, poking a noodle that rearranged itself into the word hello. Everett tilted her head. Do you regret coming here? He thought for a moment. Not yet. Ask me again when something else tries to eat me. She smiled, not just with her lips, but with a flick of her ears that he was starting to recognize as amused respect. You're not just surviving, Jake, you're becoming part of the system. That sounds ominous. It's not, she said. Yet then she slid a small data pad toward him. What's this? He asked. Your updated profile. During phase 2, we adjust your title based on contributions. Congratulations, Technician Ellison. Jake squinted at the screen. His new title read Human Systems, Liaison and Cultural Stabilizer. That sounds fake, he said. It is. Most of our titles are. It keeps hierarchy from becoming oppressive. Jake nodded slowly. I can respect that, and also, she added, standing, you're due for dream sharing with the exploratory division in an hour. He blinked. Dream sharing, yes. Don't worry, they're very gentle, mostly bring a snack. With that she glided away. Jake leaned back, letting the ceiling flicker into an image of a nebula in bloom. He was exhausted. Confused, he'd been sung at bowed to, and emotionally echoed. His feet were sore, his brain was buzzing. He didn't know whether he was being admired, studied, or slowly inducted into something he didn't understand, and yet Ploop snuggled into his lap and played a faint jingle that sounded suspiciously like Earth jazz. Jake smiled just a little. It was a weird life, but it might just be starting to feel like his. Jake had learned to stop asking questions, not because he didn't want answers, but because the answers were always stranger than the questions themselves. Take, for example, the dream interface lounge. He now found himself inside an oval chamber, gently pulsing with blue light, smelling faintly of warm cinnamon and ozone. Everything was padded, even the ceiling, especially the ceiling. You will feel a slight tingle, said the technician, a soft-spoken woman with translucent skin and ears so long they trailed like ribbons behind her, and then a mild shift in gravitational bias. Jake frowned. Define mild. Some subjects report hovering, some experience lateral identity drift. Define lateral identity drift. Oh, that's just when your consciousness temporarily perceives itself as a scent or melody. Right, sure. Why wouldn't it? She pressed something on a panel and gestured for him to sit on what looked like a jelly bean designed by a philosopher. The surface conformed instantly, humming to match his pulse. He'd been told this was all part of cognitive rapport training with the exploratory division, a routine exercise for phase 2 participants, which sounded harmless until you realized you were about to plug your dreams into a shared neural network with beings who could smell emotions and translate existential dread into wallpaper. A halo of tiny lights descended over his head. Somewhere behind him, a chime played that sounded like a polite sneeze, and then Jake blinked. He wasn't asleep, not exactly, but his mind wasn't alone anymore. Images unfolded like petals, a field of lavender, lightning, a forest made of glass, trees, a waterfall cascading in reverse, filled with voices singing the taste of memories, and in the center of it all stood JVA, arms open, smiling like someone who just discovered their favorite flavor of paradox. Welcome to our dream, she said, her voice echoing across wavelengths he didn't know he could hear. I thought dreams were supposed to be private, Jake muttered. Jiva tilted her head. Yours are very geometric. Sorry, I used to play a lot of Tetris. The shared space shifted again. Now they stood in a rotating library, where each book whispered secrets from alternate timelines. Jake instinctively reached for one labeled that time. You said no to the job on Lyra 9. It bit him. Jeba laughed, then floated upside down. Your thoughts resist symmetry. Fascinating. Tell me, why do humans always Dream of falling, because it's the only thing we're good at, Jake offered. The dream continued, now melting into a memory of his high school gym, only now the bleachers were filled with long-eared observers taking notes as he tripped over a dodgeball jiva floating. Beside him placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This is vulnerability," she said. "We cherish this," Jake blinked. "We usually try to forget it, then you waste it." He woke an hour later with glitter on his forehead and Ploop humming a lullaby into his elbow by the end of the week. Jake had grown so used to the bizarre pace of Laura 9 that the idea of normal now felt like a distant myth, like cassette tapes or traffic the crew had woven him deeper into their routines. He was asked to comment on color selections for an art installation that used thermosic pigment. He helped troubleshoot a malfunctioning translation node that had begun spitting out love poems in binary. He even taught a short seminar on Earth idioms during which half the class tried to interpret kick the bucket as a ritualistic sport. He wasn't just being watched anymore, they were emulating him. One afternoon, he walked into the mess hall and found half the crew wearing shirts with blocky human texts that read, "I break for wormholes." Another had "I'm with Squishy," pointing to a hologram of Jake's face. He didn't know whether to feel flattered or afraid. Ira invited him to a private debrief near the observation deck. The room was high above the rotation axis, a glass bubble overlooking the slow spin of stars. "You're doing well," she said without preamble. "Better than most humans." Jake asked. "Most subjects cross-species assimilation isn't easy. You've adjusted. Connected, you've even survived Jeff now. That's no small feat." Jake gave a modest shrug. "I've had worse roommates." Ira's ears flicked in amusement. "There are discussions underway about extending your contract." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You mean you want to keep me around?" "I mean," she said carefully, "some believe your presence has a stabilizing effect. The emotional variance across departments has dropped since your arrival. Productivity is up. Conflict incidents are down. Even the AI has started using softer fonts." He rubbed his temples. "So you're saying I'm calming your uniquely chaotic in a structured way, like a mathematical improvisation?" Jake blinked. "That's the nicest insult I've ever gotten." She leaned forward. "There's more off the record. There are whispers among the High Council that Lara 9 may be serving a secondary function." Jake's stomach dropped a little. "What kind of function?" "Selective integration," she said softly. "Observation is part of it, but also potential interbreeding candidates." Jake choked on absolutely nothing. "I beg your pardon." Ira's gaze didn't waver. "It's not active yet, but interest is growing. The genetic novelty of your species is, let's say, intriguing." He stood abruptly. "Okay, South, I'm just here to fix lights and not die. That was the deal. No matchmaking. No galactic dating game, right?" She smiled gently. "No one will force anything. We honor will above all." Great, Jake muttered, "because that's exactly how intergalactic history books begin." He was just a guy who liked quiet evenings, and suddenly he was space dad to 17 hybrid kids. Ira stood graceful as ever. "You should rest and consider the possibility that being chosen isn't always a burden." Jake wandered back to his quarters, mind spinning faster than the station's artificial gravity. He found a new gift on his bed, a tiny sculpture made of folded light and scented with something that reminded him of home. Next to it, a note: "We are watching still, but not studying anymore. Admiring." Jake flopped into bed, stared at the ceiling and muttered, "Working here is so different." Ploop blurped in agreement. It began with a cup of tea. Not just any tea, of course. On Lara 9, even tea was an experience infused with telepathic herbs and brewed under microgravity using a ceremonial coil that hummed Bach's cello Suite No. 1 in a minor key. Jake sipped it carefully. Seated in the central arboretum, beneath a glowing tree that gently dropped pollen shaped like stars, he'd come to expect the surreal. By now, what he hadn't expected was how familiar it all felt. Involving oversized leaves, mental focus, and giggling. Jake balanced exactly 0. leaves and managed to sneeze pollen directly into someone's eyes. "Bless you," she said, blinking rapidly. "Thanks. Also, sorry are your eyes. Supposed to do that spiral thing. Oh yes, it means I'm." Impressed, Jake wasn't sure if that made things better back in engineering. He finally found a quiet moment. The system's hub was a mess of radiant coils and crystalline consoles, every interface designed with aesthetics first logic. Second and ergonomics somewhere around seventh. He opened a diagnostic panel, finally doing what he came here for. Actual work data scrolled across a translucent screen, lines of glyphs. Interspersed with human-readable outputs, he made notes, reconfigured a junction. Found something odd, an energy dip in one of the auxiliary systems, power drain in Sector 12. He muttered, tapping the console. Could be nothing, could be a parasitic loop, or it could be a glitch caused by someone accidentally trying to upload poetry into the ventilation monitors again. That had happened on day 2. He filed a report, copied the data to his interface device, which burped for some reason and stood up just as the lights dimmed, and a low alarm pulsed through the air, nothing sharp or urgent. More like an elevator telling you it's going to floor 11, whether you like it or not. What now? He groaned, a calm, melodic voice echoed through the hall's. Sector 12, environmental controls, offline biodome. To entering containment, protocol containment, that was one of those words you never wanted to hear on a space station, right up there with evacuation irradiated, and we seem to have misplaced the gravity. Jake ran or tried to. The station's artificial gravity had a tendency to waver during emergencies, so his sprint down the corridor felt more like interpretive dance. He reached the biodome just as the massive petal-like doors sealed behind him, trapping him inside. "Okay," he muttered, "not ideal." The dome was lush and humid, filled with bioluminescent plants and softly buzzing things that weren't quite insects. And waiting, there were 4 researchers, 3 women with expressions ranging from calm to mildly delighted, and 1 carnivorous plant named Jeff who had grown considerably since Jake's last visit. "Oh good," one of the researchers said brightly. "We were hoping you'd be here." Jeff has been restless. Jeff uncurled one of his leafy appendages and gave Jake what felt like a look. Jake took a cautious step back. "Why is he restless?" "He responds to emotional vibrations, and yours are unique. Bad or unique delicious." The plant rustled ominously. "Depends on whether you scream," the researcher said cheerfully. Jeff lunged, not aggressively, more like a cat testing boundaries. Jake stumbled backward into a shelf of glowing pods, which exploded in a mist that made him sneeze 5 times in a row. Jeff recoiled. "Wait a second," Jake said, eyes watering. "He doesn't like sneezing. No. That particular sound frequency, it disrupts his sensory alignment." Jake blinked, then started humming the only Earth tune that came to mind, an old country song his grandfather used to play, deeply twangy and deeply embarrassing. Jeff coiled in on himself like a bashful fern. "It's working," someone shouted. "Keep singing so." Jake sang badly, passionately, off-key, and somehow miraculously Jeff slunk away into his corner, curling into a sulky ball of leafy disappointment. By the time the lockdown lifted, Jake was hoarse, sweaty, and hailed as a hero. A crowd gathered outside the dome as he stumbled out wheezing, and someone he didn't even know who placed a wreath of softly chirping moss on his head. "You are now the defender of the green one," Evra informed him with a solemn nod. "This is a station honor." "Great," Jake coughed. "Do I get a plaque?" "You get this," she said, handing him a single sock knitted from what looked like bioluminescent silk. It glowed in the dark. It purred. When he touched it, he blinked. "Why, 1 sock?" Ears twitched. "You've only earned half your legend." And with that, she turned and walked away. Jake stared down at the sock, then at Ploop, who blinked at him with slow, gurgling approval. It was official. He was definitely not in Kansas anymore. Jake woke up to the gentle hum of the station's artificial sunrise blooming across his ceiling, but instead of bird song or ambient music, his quarters greeted him with the sound of applause. He blinked at the walls, which had turned A bright gold, apparently a color coded for congratulations above his bed, floated a translucent display shimmering with alien glyphs, and one very clear message in English: congratulations, human Jake. You are now in phase 2 of observation, Jake. Sat up slowly. Phase. What now? Ploop, perched loyally on the nightstand, let out a curious blurp, then rolled over and emitted a celebratory puff of steam that smelled like cinnamon and static electricity. Jake sighed. The weird was no longer creeping, and it was knocking down his door and baking him congratulatory cake when he stepped into the hallway. The first thing he noticed was that no one was pretending not to stare anymore. They stared openly, respectfully, intensely. One crew member wearing robes that sparkled like space dust actually bowed. Jake tried to wave it off and bumped his elbow into a wall console, which reacted by playing what he assumed was an apology jingle, or maybe a love song. Hard to tell. Tila intercepted him near the central transit ring, her long ears twitching with amusement. Ah, you've seen the message phase 2? He asked. Yes, she said, as though this explained everything, now that we've passed the initial observation period and verified that you are mostly stable. The cultural integration phase begins. Jake paused. Wait, was I unstable before? Statistically, all humans are at first. But you've impressed us, especially with your performance in the biodome. Jeff likes you. That plant wanted to eat me. Exactly, his affection is selective. She handed him a small shimmering patch and motioned for him to stick it to his temple. This will help us understand your language's nuances better, especially the sarcasm dialect. Jake obeyed. The patch tingled like carbonation and made his ears feel slightly taller. Now, Terilla said, clapping her hands, you have appointments. He blinked. Appointments? Oh yes, cross-cultural exchanges, cognitive resonance exercises, and oh, the poet chorus has requested an audience. They say your country melody of containment was transcendent. They mean the song I sang to keep Jeff from snacking on my pancreas. Yes, they've written 6 stanzas about it. One includes interpretive smoke. Jake was whisked through the day by what felt like a well-intentioned whirlwind. First came the linguistics lab, where a tall, softly glowing alien named Jeva insisted on mimicking his speech patterns to map the emotional gradient of human idioms. Jake tried to explain the phrase killing me softly, but halfway through she began to cry, then applaud, then tried to high-five his forehead. Next was the empathy chamber, a round, softly pulsating room where he was encouraged to sit silently across from another crew member, Ren, and mutually experience emotional echoes. They stared at each other for 11 minutes. Jake thought mostly about tacos. Ren thought about something that made her laugh until she snorted through her ears' slits. Finally, there was the gift exchange. Apparently, it was customary for new members of Phase 2 to receive offerings. Jake received a cube of compressed memories, which gave him a flashback to someone else's first kiss and a battle with a jellyfish squid hybrid. A scent bottle labeled human attractor. He declined to ask what it attracted, and of course, another sock, still not a pair, still glowing over lunch, if one could call translucent noodles that rearranged themselves. A meal. Jake sat quietly in the galley, trying to process the day across from him. Era. 1 human, 100 alien women, and a job unlike anything on Earth. The docking clamps let out a hiss like a tired serpent, and Jake Ellison instinctively straightened his back, smoothed down his shirt, and reminded himself not to look as nervous as he felt the transport shuttle had been a sardine can with thrusters crammed with cargo containers, and one grumpy pilot who didn't say a word except to tell him not to touch anything glowing. And now here he was standing at the threshold of Lyra 9 Orbital Research Station, and as far as his job listing had explained, a multidisciplinary hub of alien sciences and interspecies cooperation. What it hadn't said, however, what no human resource document had dared even hint at, was that Jake would be the only human on board, or that the rest of the crew, every last one, would be alien women, 100 of them. The airlock opened with a theatrical sigh, and Jake stepped into a corridor lined with bioluminescent panels pulsing softly and welcome or warning depending on your mood. The temperature adjusted instantly. To his presence, the floor registering his weight with a chime that sounded suspiciously like a flute trying to whistle, and waiting for him at the end of the corridor, tall and utterly composed, was Commander Ibra. She was beautiful in the sort of way that made your brain hesitate and say, wait, should I be thinking that? Because everything about her was almost human, except for the elongated ears that swept back like sleek antennae and eyes the color of oxidized copper. Her uniform shimmered with a subtle iridescence, and her smile had too many layers to be entirely comforting. Welcome, Technician Ellison, she said, her voice like velvet run through an audio filter. You are different. This is promising. Jake opened his mouth to thank her and accidentally said, I like your ears. A pause, then a chuckle, not just from her, but from several figures he hadn't noticed standing in the shadows of the corridor. More long-eared women, each with subtle variations, different skin tones, eye shapes, limb proportions, but all unmistakably watching him with interest. Usually reserved for rare minerals or small confused animals, his quarters, he discovered next, were located in Section de la, curiously far from the main habitation ring. Era assured him this was for optimal comfort, which turned out to mean that the walls gently change color depending on his mood. Unfortunately, the algorithm was still learning, so after he stubbed his toe on the edge of the bed, the entire room turned a hue that could only be described as startled salmon. He took a breath, sat down on what appeared to be a bed made of woven plant fibers and humming technology, and told himself it was going to be fine. He was here to work, fix things, systems tech, keep the lights blinking and the air circulating. No big deal, just aliens, curious aliens. Female aliens, 100 of them, who apparently liked to watch. The first day was generously chaos. Jake arrived at the engineering bay expecting schematics, maybe a friendly robot, or at least a multi-limbed assistant who could explain the operating system. Instead, he met Terrilla, the station's lead neuroengineer, who introduced herself by offering him a bowl of floating orbs and asking if his species preferred direct neural ingestion or ambient absorption. Jake blinked. Tila laughed. She had ears that drooped like ivy and changed color depending on her emotions at that moment. They were a cheerful teal. You're not like I imagined, she said, cocking her head. You're squishier. Thanks, he muttered. I moisturize. Every terminal he tried to use responded in a different way. One required him to sing, another needed a trust signal, which involved placing his palm on a scanner and not thinking about sandwiches, which somehow voided the process. A third simply made a sad noise and locked him out entirely. When he asked if there was a manual, Tilla gestured to a glowing crystal and said, it will sing you the instructions if it likes you. By the end of the shift, Jake had accidentally activated the hibernation protocol for a sleeping plant colony, sent an entire drawer of sentient wrenches into mating mode, and learned that the term data dump could mean at least 4 things, only one of which was sanitary. Dinner in the galley was no less strange. A buffet stretched across a levitating table, steaming with foods of every imaginable hue, texture, and temperature. Jake opted for something that resembled mashed potatoes and instead got something that whispered advice to him in his mother's voice. He picked up a fork. It slithered away. Eventually, he ate with his fingers, earning approving nods from the table. They were all watching him again, but not in the cold, calculating way he might have feared, more like the way someone watches a pet try to open a door. Intrigued, encouraging, just a little entertained. One woman, her ears shaped like crescent moons, leaned in and whispered, do all humans eat without rhythm? I have rhythm, Jake protested. Demonstrate. He paused, then tapped his fingers on the table. The table responded by chirping and changing temperature. Never mind, she said, smiling. Back in his room, Jake lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling as it projected a calming spiral of light. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd signed up for. There had been a Contract, yes, a paycheck somewhere, but no one had prepared him for the socks made of living fibers that adjusted themselves to his feet, or the fact that the station's AI referred to him as the specimen, or that he had already received 7 gifts, 1 marriage proposal, and at least 3 very intense poems, one of which was from the cafeteria's food synthesizer. It was all too much, too. 2. A soft chime at the door. Come in, he said, unsure if it was a door or the ceiling that needed addressing. It slid open, revealing ever again she held a clipboard-like device and what looked suspiciously like a cup of tea. I thought you might need this, she said, handing it over. Calm leaf infusion, good for species adjustment. Also, I wanted to ask how many toes you have purely for research. Jake took the tea, sipped it. Blink 10, he said. Fascinating, she murmured, already typing. Then she turned and walked away, her ears twitching slightly, possibly with amusement. Jake sighed, setting the cup aside. Working here was going to be different. Jake Ellison was beginning to suspect that Larry didn't fully understand the concept of a typical workday back on Earth. His days had been a comforting loop of system checks, coffee breaks, sarcastic emails, and occasionally rebooting something just to feel powerful. Here, on this sleek, humming, moodlit orbital station, his schedule appeared to be dictated by a combination of gravitational tides, emotional consensus, and the dreams of a sleeping AI named Nora, who occasionally spoke in riddles. This particular morning started with a friendly knock, if you could call a cascading tone of harp sounds, and a sudden release of floral sent a knock. The door slid open to reveal Terrilla, standing sideways, holding what looked like a squid made of metal and steam. It's your interface assistant, she announced, cheerfully, handing it over like a birthday gift. Jake stared at it. It stared back, then it sneezed. I'm not sure that's standard, he muttered. Oh. It's not. I customized it for you. Try a beamed. It's partially sentient, emotionally responsive, and programmed to recognize patterns in your neural signature. I named it Ploop. Of course you did, Jake said, still holding the thing like it might recite a poem or bite him. What does it do? It helps you navigate the station's harmonics, synchronizes your intent with localized systems through acoustic feedback and subtle gestures. So a universal remote. Tria blinked ears, turning a puzzled lavender. What's a remote? Never mind. They walked to the main system's core with Ploop clinging to Jake's shoulder like a confused crab. The corridor ceiling shimmered overhead, displaying projections of local star clusters, though one of them flickered and showed a cat meme for 2 seconds before correcting itself. Jake didn't even react anymore. He was adapting. Sort of the crew, on the other hand, wasn't adapting. They were doubling down. Every hallway stroll was accompanied by curious glances, whispering giggles, or full-on note-taking. It wasn't hostile, far from it, but it felt like being the subject of a slow-motion documentary, narrated in a language he couldn't hear but suspected was full of metaphors about mating plumage and courtship dances. At one point, Jake stepped into the hydroponics dome to recalibrate the thermal regulators. Instead, he found himself ambushed by 4 crew members who insisted he participate in leaf balancing, a supposedly ancient tradition